Brothers and sisters, we are gathered here today to talk about God. No, not the God your grandparents are always going on about. This is about a desperate warrior turned God, turned fallen God, turned bearded father. I am, of course, talking about Kratos, son of Zeus, father of Atreus, and murderer of a heaping helping of gods, spanning across two separate pantheons. But we're not here for story time or some kind of fucking history lesson. We're here to talk about the games containing the stories and how well those games came together, as well as how well they hold up in 2022. Because you see, at this very specific moment in June of 2022, there are currently 7 God of War games available to the public, with an 8th currently scheduled to release later this year. And in anticipation for this 8th game, I've done the dirty work and replayed every single God of War game, from the 17-year-old first entry to the 5-year-old latest, so I can bring you a conclusive ranking of these games, as well as answer a burning question surrounding most of them. How well do these games even hold up? So, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. The definitive God of War ranking, June 2022, starts now with number 7, God of War Ascension. This has got to be the worst one, right? Like, this is the worst one. Guys, this is the worst one, right? But before we get full blown into why, let's talk about some of the good stuff in it. Ascension definitely has some of the best big set piece moments in the franchise, possibly even rivaling that of the iconic Kronos fight. The first big opening battle in Ascension against the Hecatonkres actually has some really dope spectacle moments, and especially the final fight against Alecto, the Fury Queen in her more monstrous form, is a top tier cinematic spectacle set piece moment, whatever the fuck you want to call it. It's fire. When her tentacle flings you down into the water and her face appears from out of the darkness, that shit is fucking sick. It's also just a pretty good fight. The last bit where you're fighting both her and her sister is challenging, but not so overwhelming that it frustrates you. It just makes for a good final fight. But yeah, the compliments stop there, man. I don't know that there's anything else good about this. The whole game is like a lazier, dumbed down version of things that came before it in a lot of ways. Which is a shame, because at the time of its release, it was the 6th game in the series and the 4th mainline entry. So you'd think it would come in with improvements or at least meaningful shakeups to the formula, but it just doesn't. Instead, it's this half-assed, half-baked effort, both narratively and gameplay-wise. The changes it makes to existing parts of the franchise, as well as maybe like the one new mechanic, are thinly veiled attempts to make this seem like it isn't just more of the same, minus any long-standing narrative pull. In other words, it's worse. Instead of feeling like you know what your narrative motivation and goal is, like you're actually Kratos, this just feels like random room-to-room gauntlet style fighting with a paper-thin story sprinkled in. And the story is told in this weird non-linear fashion where there's like flashbacks and flash forwards, but they last hours, so you just get confused and are like, wait, is what I'm doing from before, is it now? What the fuck is going on? It's horrible. And forget the fucking story for a second. Forget the narrative. Forget how unclear Kratos' motivations are. Look at the gameplay and level design for a second. There was a puzzle in this game where I had no idea what I was trying to do. Now hold on, I know what you're thinking. Well, it's a puzzle, it's supposed to be a little confusing, right? A little perplexing, right? No, you don't get it, you don't understand. I solved the puzzle. It didn't even take that long. But I didn't even understand what I was trying to do. I still don't understand. My point is, everything was so poorly communicated to me. How bad is your puzzle that I could solve it reasonably quick and still have no idea what the goal was? But you know what? In a nutshell, at the end of the day, They took the bare bones of a God of War game, slapped a bright ass saturation filter on it, and called it Ascension. Good on them. Let's move on. Now coming in at number 6, just above Ascension, is Chains of Olympus. This was one of the 2 God of War games that was on the PSP, and as you might expect of a PSP game, it's pretty fucking straightforward. This is the most straightforward a God of War game has ever been. Most God of War games have this faux Metroidvania approach where the game's levels are interwoven and gated off for you to come back later like a typical Metroidvania. However, it is not up to you to find out where you can go, get a tool, come back, and figure out the pathway that tool unlocks. The God of Wars leads you down a mostly obvious linear path, and when the linear path rewards you with the new tool, you will then be looped back around to somewhere you've already been, with the path you've just been down forever closed, and a new path able to be opened via your new tool. Like a really hand-holdy Metroidvania, and it's always worked out pretty well. Chains of Olympus does not do this. Chains of Olympus says, walk in a straight line, fight some guys, get a cutscene, do a puzzle, fight some guys, watch a cutscene. It's actually fine, and it's a pretty inoffensive experience. It's not long, it's like 5 hours maybe. It's really taking the handheld bite-sized mentality to heart. And while it pretty much fails to be remarkable in any way, it also fails to be particularly shitty. The story, as you may have guessed, is a non-essential one that just adds a little more flair to God of War 2 and 3. Again, it's not a horrible story. It's not remarkable. It's just there. But there is a part in the story where Kratos is reunited with his daughter in the afterlife, but he has to reject living in Elysium with her in order to regain his abilities and save all of existence or some shit. But instead of him having a touching yet gut-wrenching moment of like, daddy has to leave you now, don't cry, I'll find you again type of thing, he just very shittily pushes her off him. And they make you tap the button to push her. It's legitimately terrible. I hated it, but let's move on. Straight to number 5. And we're still on the PSP here, folks, because number 5 is Ghost of Sparta. Unlike its PSP brother Chains of Olympus, Ghost of Sparta treats itself with a little more respect, at least in a gameplay and level design sense. Ghost of Sparta readopts that faux Metroidvania approach to level design that I spoke about, and it's all the better for it. In totality, this game has some good magic abilities. Every now and then they work in a good reason for you to actually swap your weapon, a couple of decent puzzles in there, and mostly good combat encounters. I actually think the weakest part of Ghost of Sparta is its story. Like Chains of Olympus, it just serves as main narrative flair, but I feel the pacing and payoff are worse here than they were in Chains. Gameplay wise though, Ghost of Sparta can mostly fit right in with the mainline titles. The biggest gameplay hiccup it probably has is this weird ass vortex fight where you're on a boat in the middle of a whirlpool and you basically have to fend off Atlantean mermen for like 15 minutes with no health orbs or chests in sight. It's actually fucking nutty and is a very shitty difficulty spike. I can only think of one worse spike in difficulty in the God of War franchise, and to point it out, I unfortunately have to head back to God of War Ascension. This spike in Ascension, where like the second to the last combat encounter you have is a crazy unbalanced gauntlet of enemies with like 3 floors to it, and if you die on any floor you have to start over. It's actually fucking awful, to the point that during my replay I wondered how I ever beat this to begin with. But anyway, look at me, I was talking about Ghost of Sparta and now I'm back shitting on Ascension. You know what, let's just move on to number 4. And our 4th in line for the crown is gonna be the OG God of War from 2005. This is the one that set the stage, and set the stage is a perfect phrase because its opening moments really do set the fucking stage. You see, if you've ever noticed, every God of War game opens up with a big bombastic boss fight, usually against some oversized creature in a crazy destruction-ridden environment. In God of War 2 it was the Colossus, in 3 it's Poseidon, even Chains of Olympus had you face the Basilisk. But that all started with the Hydra in the first God of War. right from the off. You're on a boat, under attack by minions of Ares and a fucking Hydra. The game just opens up by putting you right in the fray of an exhilarating spectacle that astonishingly is still effective to this day. This might legitimately be one of the best opening levels ever. It's that good. But yeah, the original God of War is a pretty easy game, but not in a bad way. It's fast paced, it does a lot to make you feel powerful and even clever at times. It's not without its issues, obviously. This thing is a 2005 action game, so it's not remarkably deep. The level design is fairly well crafted, and I'd say it holds up pretty solidly for a 17-year-old game. Nothing about the game feels like, oh hell no, I can't play this, it's too fucking old. Which certain games do begin to suffer from once they reach these old ages, and not feeling like that is the accomplishment here, because odds are a game won't feel outstanding 17 years later. All in all, I'd say God of War plays like a slightly better, less clunky, less obtuse Devil May Cry 3, a franchise that God of War very obviously took gameplay inspiration from. But now, let's move on. And we're in the top 3 now, people. So to start us off at number 3 is God of War 2. Now this was a close one because God of War 1 and 2 are almost interchangeable in my eyes, because for every positive change that 2 had, you're also hit with nearly the same amount of negatives. For example, God of War 2 has much tougher encounters than the first one. This is a plus to me, because at this point the series could use a few stark challenges to really balance out the relative ease of the first game. However, 2's encounters are much more than just a good amount of challenging battles strategically placed throughout the game. The encounters, unfortunately, boast wildly damaged, spongy, common enemies. It feels like nothing dies in this game. So it makes the triumphant high of coming out on top of a particularly difficult fight immediately flatline at the sight of another drawn out and daunting battle instantly around the next corner. So I think if the idea of an elongated challenge is appealing to you, you'll want God of War 2. But if you'd rather feel more powerful and just grab some collectibles along the way, then you'll want God of War 1. What gives 2 the edge in this list for me is that I think the story is a little bit better. A little better told, a little more compelling. And I think that's the only reason why it gets this place over God of War 1. I think if you just look at the base number of a numerical rating for these games, they'd have the same score for me. It wouldn't be until you got down to the decimals that you see 2 has a slight advantage, in my opinion. But now, let's move forward to our silver medal winner. Number 2 on our list, God of War 3. Listen, this game was firing on all cylinders. This game took the classic God of War formula as far as it could go. And that's why when Ascension came out, still iterating on this formula, there's nowhere to go but down. God of War 3 was a great action game in 2010. It is a great action game right now, I'm happy to say. First of all, they finally found that sweet spot of difficulty between God of War 1 and the hardest game in the franchise, God of War 2. You won't get out of God of War 3 unscathed, but you also won't throw your controller through your TV. 3 perfectly breaks up the action like Ascension never could. It separates the harsher fights like 2 never did. The balancing of combat and puzzles and narrative and gliding sections, it's all so expertly crafted. These fuckers at Sony Santa Monica were on their P's and fucking Q's here. The game ends so well, and not to mention the spectacle of it all. The Kronos battle is an iconic gaming moment for good reason. God of War 3 is just a masterclass in game pacing, really. Where to place your challenges, where to place your big moments and things like that. 12 years later, a ton of games released without a prayer of ever being anywhere near as fun or exciting. I'm making the game sound perfect, it isn't, but it's rare that you revisit something you loved from a decade ago and it's still objectively great. So yeah, God of War 3. But we're not done. We've got one more, and obviously, you know what it is. It couldn't have been anything else. The #1 God of War game as of June 2022 is God of War 2018. And I already said it. God of War 3 took the formula as far as it could go. They tried to up the ante one more time with Ascension and it was a no-go. So logically, what do? You changed the whole fucking formula. The gaming audience has changed. The landscape has changed. 2018's God of War brought the franchise up to speed after 5 years of absence and 8 years since their last worthwhile outing. I honestly think they'd rather forget Ascension. But not only did God of War 2018 modernize the franchise and its protagonist, but it did so better than most things and as well as anything available in gaming. I'm just gonna say this real quick and then I'm gonna explain why. God of War 2018 is easily one of the best games ever made. It is, in my eyes, without debate, a 10 out of 10 game. Now when you say 10 out of 10, people go, oh, that game's not perfect. No, nothing's perfect, you idiots. When you say a game, a movie, anything is 10 out of 10, it's because the good outweighs the bad in such an unequivocal manner that the flaws are largely irrelevant. This game meets that criteria. There has never been a game with such a perfect balance of narrative and gameplay. There just hasn't. And let me explain exactly what I mean. The weight of the story and the weight of the gameplay are distributed perfectly as equals in this game. It's not something like Uncharted or The Last of Us, the first The Last of Us, not part 2, where you just want to see the fucking story. You almost have to endure playing the game to get the story of this game that very clearly just wants to be a movie. On the other end, this isn't Doom Eternal or Elden Ring, where the story is basically optional. The focus is the gameplay. And both those games have really rich lore, but it's not the focal point at all. It's just a framework for the gameplay. And don't get it fucked up, I like all those games that I just mentioned. All good, if not great games in their own right. But now as I talk about this story gameplay balance that God of War has, you may be thinking, I've played other games where I've experienced that kind of balance before. To that I say, I don't doubt it. I have too. Here's the critical difference. It's rare that a balance between story and gameplay can even be made equal. But even when it happens, the gameplay and narrative are not of this quality. So let's take a hypothetical game real quick. In this hypothetical game, it has perfectly balanced gameplay and story distribution. They both have the same time to shine and or quality. But even in those rare cases, they might be firing at an in-sync story gameplay quality of like 6 and 6 or 7 and 7. And most times, even if they're distributed evenly, it doesn't mean they'll match in quality. So neither story or gameplay is prioritized over the other, but the dev team just executed one better. So it ends up an 8 in gameplay and a 5 in story, or a 6 in story and a 7 in gameplay, something like that. What I'm getting at with God of War is we've never seen the narrative gameplay distributed so well while both are firing at such a high level. Something like 8 in the narrative, 9 in the gameplay, 9 in the gameplay, 10 in the narrative, 8 in the narrative, 10 in the gameplay, 10 in the narrative, 10 in the gameplay, you know, something like that. That's what this game did. That's what's different about it. Not only are the gameplay and story beats both given equal footing, but they're both fucking immaculate. And this isn't the only way to be a 10 out of 10 game. There are games that are nothing like this that I think are 10 out of 10. There's more than one path to that score, but this is why I think this game is a 10 out of 10. So, yeah, there it is. My ranking of the God of War games. As far as holding up in 2022, I think all of them are still playable, but the only ones with the capacity to still impress people are God of War 3 and God of War 2018. You of course no doubt know that God of War Ragnarok is scheduled to come out later this year as of this recording. And I've got to say, after replaying all of these, and especially 2018, I think that Ragnarok has the wiggle room necessary to go out and get a second consecutive 10 out of 10. I was reluctant to say that because I'd hate to jinx it, but honestly, the possibility of making certain smaller refinements in the 2018 formula, coupled with the opportunity to modernize more unused aspects from the original God of War trilogy, could possibly give Santa Monica the ability to maintain a 10 through 2 consecutive games. It's a fucking long shot, honestly, but it is possible if you ask me. Only time will tell though. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at WaifuBelector. But until next time, I am WaifuBelector. I am just a normal guy. I like hentai, and I can't wait to see where Ragnarok fits into all this. Goodbye.